In the spring of 1945, as the Third Reich crumbled into dust and ash, one of Hitler's most loyal servants found himself transformed from a powerful diplomat into a desperate fugitive. This is the story of Joachim von Ribbentrop, champagne salesman turned Nazi foreign minister, and the dramatic manhunt that brought him to justice. His journey from the corridors of power to a shabby boarding house in Hamburg reveals not just the collapse of one man's fortune, but the complete disintegration of the Nazi regime itself. This is a tale of betrayal, desperation, and the relentless pursuit of justice in the chaotic final days of World War II. To understand how far Ribbentrop fell, we must first understand how high he had climbed. Joachim von Ribbentrop was not born into the aristocracy his name suggested. In fact, the von in his name was adopted, a pretension that many in German high society found laughable. Born in 1893 in Wesel, Germany, young Joachim came from a middle-class military family with modest means and even more modest prospects. His early life was unremarkable. He served as an officer in the First World War, seeing action on both the Eastern and Western fronts. Unlike many of Hitler's inner circle who became radicalized by their war experiences, Ribbentrop emerged from the conflict with more commercial ambitions than political ones. After the war ended, he found his calling not in politics, but in business, specifically as a champagne salesman. And he was good at it. Very good. Ribbentrop married Anneliese Henkel, the daughter of a wealthy champagne producer, which gave him both capital and connections. Through the 1920s, he cultivated relationships with Germany's elite, throwing lavish parties and building a reputation as a man who knew how to move in high society. He spoke several languages, had lived abroad, and possessed the kind of cosmopolitan polish that was rare in the provincial world of early Nazi politics. His entry into Hitler's orbit came through social connections rather than ideological fervor. In 1932, he met Hitler through mutual acquaintances and offered his Berlin villa for secret meetings between the Nazi leader and influential industrialists and politicians. Hitler, always calculating, saw in Ribbentrop something useful, a man who could open doors to the upper echelons of German society that were typically closed to the rougher elements of the Nazi Party. Ribbentrop joined the Nazi Party and the SS, and Hitler began using him for diplomatic missions. Despite having no formal training in diplomacy, Ribbentrop's confidence never wavered. Critics, and there were many, found him vain, pompous, and woefully out of his depth. Even within the Nazi hierarchy, he was widely disliked. Hermann Goering once quipped that Ribbentrop bought his name, married his money, and swindled his way into office. But Hitler valued loyalty above competence, and Ribbentrop was unfailingly loyal. In 1936, Hitler appointed Ribbentrop as ambassador to the court of St. James, Germany's representative to Great Britain. It was a prestigious posting, but Ribbentrop's tenure would become legendary for all the wrong reasons. From the moment he arrived in London, Ribbentrop managed to offend British sensibilities. At his first meeting with King Edward VIII, he gave the Nazi salute, a shocking breach of protocol that immediately marked him as either ignorant or deliberately provocative. British society found him insufferable. He was arrogant, humorless, and seemed to fundamentally misunderstand British culture and politics. Ribbentrop's mission was to secure an Anglo-German alliance, or at least British neutrality, in Hitler's coming conquests. He believed that Britain's aristocracy secretly admired Nazi Germany, and that the British government could be persuaded to give Hitler a free hand in Eastern Europe. This was a catastrophic misreading of the situation, but Ribbentrop never wavered in his convictions. During the era of appeasement, as Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain desperately tried to avoid another war, Ribbentrop assured Hitler that Britain would never fight. He interpreted British reluctance to confront Germany as weakness and cowardice rather than a tragic attempt to preserve peace. His reports back to Berlin were filled with wishful thinking and dangerous miscalculations. British officials and diplomats who dealt with Ribbentrop found him increasingly impossible. He would lecture them about the superiority of the Nazi system, make demands rather than requests, and seemed genuinely puzzled when his bombast was met with cold British reserve. One British diplomat described him as combining stupidity and self-importance in equal measure. His social climbing reached absurd heights. He desperately wanted to be accepted by the British aristocracy, yet his methods only earned their contempt. He threw elaborate parties that were either ignored or attended out of diplomatic obligation. When he did secure invitations to exclusive events, his behavior, boastful, crude, and politically tone-deaf, ensured he was rarely invited back. Behind the scenes, Ribbentrop was also involved in more sinister activities. He cultivated relationships with British fascists and Nazi sympathizers, hoping to create a fifth column that would support German interests. He met with the Duke of Windsor, the former King Edward VIII, feeding Hitler's fantasies about restoring a friendly monarch to the British throne. By 1938, even Hitler recognized that Ribbentrop's mission to Britain had failed. But rather than seeing this as his ambassador's fault, Hitler blamed the British for their stubbornness. And in a decision that would have profound consequences for world history, Hitler promoted Ribbentrop to Foreign Minister of the Reich. As Foreign Minister, Ribbentrop became one of the principal architects of the diplomatic machinery that led to World War II. He was involved in virtually every major foreign policy decision the Nazi regime made between 1938 and 1941. His influence, while eventually waning, was significant in the crucial years when war became inevitable. In March 1939, Ribbentrop was present when Hitler intimidated the elderly Czech president Emil Hácha into surrendering what remained of Czechoslovakia. The tactics used, threatening to bomb Prague into rubble while the president suffered a heart attack, were brutal, even by Nazi standards. Ribbentrop stood by, offering nothing but encouragement for Hitler's threats. But Ribbentrop's most infamous achievement came in August 1939, the Nazi-Soviet Pact. This stunning agreement between Hitler and Stalin shocked the world. The two ideological enemies, Nazism and communism, had agreed to a non-aggression pact that included secret protocols dividing Eastern Europe between them. Ribbentrop flew to Moscow and personally negotiated with Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov. The famous photograph from that occasion shows Ribbentrop and Molotov signing the treaty while Stalin stands behind them, a slight smile on his face. Both dictators knew this was a temporary arrangement, a breathing space before inevitable conflict. But in the short term, it gave Hitler the freedom to attack Poland without fear of Soviet intervention, and it gave Stalin time to prepare for the German invasion he knew would eventually come. When Hitler ordered the invasion of Poland on September 1, 1939, plunging Europe into war, Ribbentrop was there to provide the diplomatic cover. He concocted false pretexts for the invasion and tried, unsuccessfully, to prevent Britain and France from honoring their guarantees to Poland. When Britain declared war on September 3rd, Ribbentrop was reportedly stunned. Despite all evidence to the contrary, he had convinced himself and assured Hitler that Britain would back down once again. Ribbentrop continued his diplomatic efforts as the war expanded. He was instrumental in bringing Italy firmly into the war on Germany's side, though this proved to be more burden than benefit. He helped negotiate the Tripartite Pact in September 1940, creating the formal Axis alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. On paper, it looked impressive, a global alliance spanning 3 continents. In practice, there was little coordination between the Axis powers, and they often worked at cross purposes. He also pursued a disastrous attempt to bring the Soviet Union into the Axis alliance. In November 1940, Molotov visited Berlin for negotiations. During the discussions, British bombers attacked the city, a pointed reminder of Britain's continued resistance. When the talks broke down over Stalin's demands in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, it became clear that the Nazi-Soviet pact would not last. As the war progressed, however, Ribbentrop's role diminished. Hitler increasingly made military decisions without consulting his foreign minister. What need was there for diplomacy when Germany was conquering Europe by force? Ribbentrop found himself sidelined, issuing pronouncements that nobody read and attending meetings where nobody listened to him. By 1945, Joachim von Ribbentrop had become a figure of mockery, even within the crumbling Nazi regime. The foreign minister who had once brokered deals with Stalin and strutted through the halls of power was now an irrelevance. The war that he had helped unleash had turned into a catastrophe for Germany, and there was no diplomacy that could save the Third Reich from its fate. In the bunker beneath Berlin, as Soviet artillery pounded the city above, the Nazi leadership gathered for Adolf Hitler's 56th and final birthday on April 20th, 1945. It was a surreal scene, men in elegant uniforms congratulating their Führer while the ceiling shook from nearby explosions and plaster dust drifted down like snow. Ribbentrop was there, of course. He still clung to his title and his proximity to Hitler, even as both became meaningless. The foreign minister made awkward small talk, offered birthday wishes, and tried to maintain the pretense that things were not as desperate as they clearly were. Other Nazi leaders at least had the sense to look grim. Ribbentrop, according to witnesses, seemed almost cheerfully oblivious to reality. 3 days later, on April 23rd, Ribbentrop made a final desperate attempt to see Hitler privately. Perhaps he had some brilliant diplomatic solution to offer, some last-minute negotiation that might save something from the ruins. More likely, he simply wanted reassurance, wanted to hear from Hitler's lips that he still mattered, that his years of loyalty counted for something. Hitler refused to see him. The rejection was delivered bluntly by Hitler's adjutants. The Führer had better things to do than waste time with his foreign minister. It was a devastating blow. After years of loyalty, after all the missions and negotiations, after hitching his entire identity to Hitler's cause, Ribbentrop was dismissed like an unwanted salesman at the door. This was the moment when Ribbentrop must have understood that his world had completely collapsed. If Hitler, desperate, isolated, facing imminent defeat, wouldn't even spare him a few minutes, then he truly had nothing left. As the Red Army tightened its grip on Berlin, fighting house to house through the shattered streets, Ribbentrop fled north. He gathered what remained of his staff and headed for Flensburg, near the Danish border, where Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz was attempting to establish a new German government. Hitler had named Dönitz as his successor before committing suicide on April 30th in the bunker. For a brief, bizarre moment, Dönitz tried to maintain the fiction of a functioning German government even as the Reich dissolved around him. Various Nazi officials descended on Flensburg, hoping to secure positions in whatever came next. Among them was Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsführer SS, architect of the Holocaust, and one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. Like Ribbentrop, Himmler was looking for a role in the new order. Both men were to be bitterly disappointed. Dönitz wanted nothing to do with either of them. He was trying to negotiate surrender terms with the Allies and had no interest in being associated with the most notorious figures of the Nazi regime. Ribbentrop and Himmler were political poison, and Dönitz knew it. He made it clear that their services were not required. Joachim von Ribbentrop was now a man without a country, without a position, and without protection. The vast apparatus that had once supported him, the foreign ministry with its hundreds of staff, the SD bodyguards, the fleet of cars, the network of safe houses, had all disappeared. Most of his 300-person staff had simply melted away in the chaos of Germany's collapse, each person scrambling to save themselves. Ribbentrop decided to head south to Hamburg. Perhaps the choice was sentimental. He knew the city well from his days as a champagne salesman in the 1920s, when life had been simpler and his future had seemed bright. He had friends there, or at least he had once had friends there. In his desperation, he convinced himself that these old connections might save him. Hamburg was about to fall to the British Second Army. The city had been devastated by Allied bombing, particularly the firestorm of 1943 that had killed over 40,000 people. Now it was filling with refugees fleeing from the east, displaced persons, surrendered soldiers, and Nazi officials trying to disappear into the chaos. Ribbentrop sought out an old friend, someone he had known for 20 years, a relationship that dated back to his champagne-selling days. He appeared at this man's door, probably expecting that old loyalty, shared history, or even just basic human compassion would guarantee him shelter. He was wrong. The friend refused to help him. We don't know exactly what words were exchanged at that doorstep, but we can imagine the scene. Ribbentrop, still dressed in one of his expensive suits, probably trying to maintain his dignity, making his case. The friend, perhaps apologetic, but firm, certainly afraid of what harboring such a notorious Nazi might mean for his own family. The door closing. This rejection must have been almost as painful as Hitler's refusal to see him. If he couldn't even count on a friend of 20 years, then he truly was alone. With nowhere else to go, Ribbentrop adopted a false identity. He became Herr Reiser, just another displaced German trying to survive in a defeated nation. He found a cheap lodging house, the kind of place where questions weren't asked as long as the rent was paid. It was a far cry from the grand embassies and ministries where he had once held court. The one-time foreign minister, the man who had negotiated with Stalin and signed treaties in the name of the Third Reich, was now living in a shabby room in a boarding house, trying desperately to blend in with thousands of other anonymous, defeated Germans. He attempted to maintain some routine, some semblance of his former life. Each day he would take a walk through Hamburg's ruined streets. He still wore his elegant suits. He had nothing else, and besides, his vanity wouldn't permit him to dress down. He added a black trilby hat and dark glasses, perhaps thinking these made him less recognizable. In reality, they probably had the opposite effect. In a city full of people in threadbare clothes and military cast-offs, a man in a fine suit and dark glasses would have stood out considerably. For a few weeks, this masquerade worked. Hamburg was chaos. The British were focused on establishing order, processing millions of German prisoners of war, dealing with displaced persons from across Europe, and beginning the enormous task of military government. One middle-aged man in dark glasses was easy to overlook among the multitudes. But Ribbentrop's past was catching up with him. The British had taken over the Gestapo headquarters in Hamburg, a grimly appropriate reversal of fortune. The building where the secret police had once terrorized the population was now the center of Allied intelligence operations. British field security teams were working with a list of wanted Nazis, using a combination of tips from informants, former Abwehr intelligence agents who had switched sides, and good old-fashioned detective work. Ribbentrop's name was near the top of that list. As foreign minister, he was automatically on the roster of major war criminals to be tried. The British assumed he had probably been captured by the Soviets during the fall of Berlin, or that he had died in the chaos. Several reports suggested he had been seen in Soviet-controlled territory. The last thing they expected was that he would be hiding in Hamburg, right under their noses. Then came the betrayal. Ribbentrop's friend's son, the son of the man who had refused Ribbentrop shelter, decided to ingratiate himself with the new occupiers. Perhaps he was genuinely outraged by the Nazi regime. Perhaps he wanted to prove his own anti-Nazi credentials. Perhaps he simply saw an opportunity to gain favor with the British authorities. Whatever his motivation, he reported that Joachim von Ribbentrop, the former foreign minister, was living somewhere in Hamburg under a false name. The British were stunned. If this information was true, it was a major coup. Ribbentrop was one of the most senior Nazi officials they could hope to capture. He would be a star defendant at any war crimes trial. Orders came down immediately. find him and arrest him. Intelligence officers began the careful work of tracking him down. In a city of over 1 million people, many of them refugees using false papers, finding one man was no easy task. But they had advantages. Ribbentrop was distinctive, tall, well-dressed, with aristocratic manners that he couldn't entirely disguise. And he had habits, routines. The British learned about his daily walks, his lodging house, his movements. By June 15, 1945, 5 weeks after the war in Europe had ended, they had him located. A raid was planned, but it was kept small, 1 officer and 2 sergeants. There was no need for a large force. Ribbentrop was not expected to be armed or to resist. This was an arrest, not a battle. The raid took place early in the morning. The 3-man British team arrived at the cheap lodging house where Ribbentrop had been staying. They knew which room was his. They had been thorough in their surveillance. There would be no escape this time. They hammered on the door, the sound echoing through the quiet boarding house. After a moment, the door was opened by a young woman dressed in a negligée. Her presence added another layer of pathos to the scene. Even in hiding, even as a fugitive using a false name, Ribbentrop had apparently maintained some of his old lifestyle. The British pushed past her into the room. There, in the bed, they found Joachim von Ribbentrop, naked and fast asleep. The foreign minister who had once strode through the halls of power, who had negotiated with Stalin, who had been present at so many of the crucial moments that led to World War II, was caught in perhaps the most undignified circumstances possible. He was roused from sleep to find British soldiers standing over him. One can only imagine his thoughts in that moment, fear certainly, but perhaps also a kind of relief. The weeks of hiding, of looking over his shoulder, of jumping at every sound, were over. His fate was now in others' hands. Among his possessions, the British found several revealing items. There was a vial of cyanide, the suicide pill that many high-ranking Nazis carried as insurance against capture. Ribbentrop had not used it. Perhaps he lacked the courage, or perhaps some part of him still believed he could talk his way out of trouble. The champagne salesman's instinct never entirely died. They also found a Nazi armband, a strange thing to keep while in hiding under a false identity. Was it sentimentality? An inability to fully let go of his identity? Or did he imagine some scenario where the Nazis might somehow rise again, and he would need proof of his loyalty? Most bizarrely, they discovered a long, rambling letter addressed to British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. We don't know the full contents of this letter, but we can imagine Ribbentrop attempting to explain himself, to justify his actions, perhaps to propose some kind of negotiation. The man who had completely misunderstood Britain during his time as ambassador apparently still believed he might somehow reach an understanding with British leadership. It was delusional, pathetic, and entirely in character. Ribbentrop was formally arrested and taken into custody. The British treated him correctly, as a prisoner of war and a defendant in waiting. But there was no courtesy beyond what military regulations required. The man who had once demanded protocol and respect as foreign minister was now prisoner number 10532. Joachim von Ribbentrop's trial at Nuremberg was, in many ways, inevitable from the moment of his capture. As foreign minister, he was one of the most senior Nazi officials in Allied custody. The Nuremberg trials were designed to prosecute the major war criminals, those who bore the greatest responsibility for the war and for Nazi atrocities. During the trial, Ribbentrop cut a poor figure. The confidence and arrogance that had marked his earlier career had evaporated. He appeared confused, evasive, and unable to mount any coherent defense. When questioned about his role in initiating the war, in negotiating the pacts that enabled Nazi aggression, in implementing policies that led to atrocities, he claimed he was merely following orders, merely carrying out Hitler's will. It was the same defense offered by so many Nazi officials, and it was equally unpersuasive in Ribbentrop's case. The prosecution demonstrated that he had been an enthusiastic participant in Nazi crimes, not a reluctant functionary. His signature appeared on documents ordering the deportation of Jews. He had actively supported the aggressive wars that cost millions of lives. He had known about the concentration camps and had done nothing to stop the Holocaust. Perhaps most damningly, he had helped create the diplomatic framework that made Nazi aggression possible. Without the Nazi-Soviet pact, Germany could not have attacked Poland. Without the tripartite pact, the global conflict might have remained limited. Ribbentrop's diplomacy had enabled catastrophe on a world historical scale. On October 1, 1946, the verdicts were delivered. Ribbentrop was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and waging wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death by hanging. In his final days, Ribbentrop was a broken man. The vanity and self-importance had drained away, leaving only fear and regret. He wrote letters to his family, expressing love for his wife and children, but offering little in the way of genuine remorse for his actions. To the end, he seemed more concerned with his own fate than with the millions who had died as a result of the policies he had supported. On October 16, 1946, Joachim von Ribbentrop was led to the gallows in the Nuremberg prison gymnasium. He was the first of the condemned Nazi leaders to be hanged that night. As he climbed the steps to the scaffold, he reportedly said, "God protect Germany. My last wish is that Germany's unity shall be preserved, and that an understanding be reached between East and West." His body, along with those of the other executed Nazi leaders, was cremated. The ashes were scattered in a river at a location kept secret to prevent the creation of any memorial or shrine. There would be no grave for Joachim von Ribbentrop, no place for admirers to visit. He would vanish as completely as the Third Reich he had served. The story of Joachim von Ribbentrop's capture is more than just a manhunt. It's a parable about the collapse of power, the betrayal of loyalty, and the inevitable consequences of serving evil. The champagne salesman who climbed to the heights of Nazi power ended his days naked in a shabby boarding house, arrested by the army of the nation he had once tried to manipulate. In the end, neither his expensive suits, nor his aristocratic pretensions, nor his years of loyalty to Hitler could save him from justice. His fall from foreign minister to fugitive to convicted war criminal took less than 3 months, a trajectory as swift and complete as the collapse of the regime he represented. History remembers him not as the sophisticated diplomat he imagined himself to be, but as one of the architects of humanity's darkest chapter, a man whose vanity and ambition helped enable the deaths of millions. His capture in Hamburg and his execution at Nuremberg stand as reminders that even the most powerful eventually face accountability for their crimes. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this, hit like and subscribe for more untold stories from history. Drop your thoughts in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.